She was born on a rainy morning, in a village tucked between towering trees and whispering winds, a place where nature ruled quietly, and time moved slowly, like the river that curved around it. Her name was Lila. From the very beginning, people noticed something unusual about her. While other babies cried or laughed, Lila was silent. Her eyes, wide and thoughtful, seemed to always be listening, not to people, but to something else, something deeper. As she grew, the differences became clearer. She never spoke a word, not a single one. Doctors from the city called it a disorder. Villagers whispered it was a curse. Her mother wept in secret. Her father built fences, not just around the house, but around their lives. But Lila wasn't broken. She just saw the world differently. She didn't like toys. She didn't like loud voices. But she loved the rustling of trees, the flapping of bird wings, the echo of monkey calls from the canopy above. While other children played with dolls and sticks, Lila would sit by the forest's edge for hours, watching, listening, humming softly. Sounds that didn't belong to any language, yet felt ancient. People began to fear her strange habits. When she mimicked the hoot of an owl or the growl of a leopard, even the bravest boys in the village kept their distance. Some said she could talk to animals. Others said she was one. Her parents tried everything, tutors, healers, even prayers. But nothing changed, except one thing. Every morning, before sunrise, Lila would walk to the same spot near the jungle and sit quietly. She'd hum low, rhythmic notes. She'd draw circles in the dirt. She'd wait, as if she were calling someone. And though no one else knew it, someone was listening. One day, as the sun began to dip low behind the trees, Lila wandered deeper into the jungle than ever before. The leaves brushed against her skin like soft whispers, and the air smelled of damp earth and distant rain. She didn't know why she walked, only that something was pulling her. A quiet call, a familiar sound that she couldn't quite explain. The jungle felt alive, as if it were waiting for her. And then she saw him. At first it was just a shadow, moving gracefully through the dense undergrowth. A large figure, its outline framed by the fading light. Lila stood still, her heart pounding. She knew instinctively that this wasn't just any animal. This was something different, something important. As she took a step closer, the figure emerged from the shadows. A giant, silverback gorilla. His fur a mix of silver and dark brown, his eyes deep and wise. Kumo, the gorilla, had lived in the jungle for years, known by the other animals for his intelligence and strength. But he was not the kind to be seen by humans, not unless he wanted to be. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She didn't move. She didn't speak. But she wasn't afraid. There was something in Kumo's gaze that made her feel as if she had always known him. And then, something unexpected happened. Kumo tilted his head slightly, his large eyes never leaving hers. Slowly, he raised his hand and made a sound. It wasn't a roar or a growl, but a low, rhythmic hum. A sound that seemed familiar, like something Lila had heard before. A sound that matched the hum she made at the forest's edge. Lila took a tentative step forward, and then another, until she was standing just a few feet away from the massive gorilla. Her fingers twitched as she mimicked the sound he had made. She hummed softly, the same rhythm, the same pattern. To her surprise, Kumo responded. He repeated the hum, but this time, a little louder, a little deeper. It was almost as if he was waiting for her to respond again. And so, she did. For hours they sat together in the fading light, communicating without words, without the need for anything more than the sound of their voices, and the understanding that passed between them. The villagers would never believe it. They would never understand. But to Lila, this moment was more real than anything she had ever known. She wasn't alone. Kumo, the gorilla, understood her. And in that moment, the world she had always felt so distant from suddenly felt like a place she belonged. The days that followed were different. Lila returned to the jungle every day, finding Kumo waiting for her in the same spot. No words were exchanged, but the silence between them was filled with an understanding that neither of them had ever known. As the days passed, Lila began to realize that she was not just mimicking sounds anymore. She was speaking to Kumo. Not with words, but with sounds that flowed between them like an unspoken language. Lila learned the patterns of the jungle's calls, the chirp of a bird, the distant growl of a wild cat, the rustling of leaves as small animals scurried across the ground. But it wasn't just the animals she learned about. She learned the rhythm of the wind, the sound of raindrops falling on leaves, the hum of the earth beneath her feet. Every sound had its own story, its own meaning, and Kumo understood it all. He didn't just mimic the sounds, he felt them just as deeply as Lila did. When she hummed, he would respond, his deep voice blending with hers in perfect harmony. Sometimes they would sit in silence for hours, simply listening to the jungle around them. Other times, they would make their own music, a blend of hums, growls, and rustling noises that filled the air with a strange, beautiful rhythm. But it wasn't just about communication. It was about connection. Lila had always felt like an outsider in the village, like no one could understand her. But with Kumo, there were no judgments, no whispers behind her back. There was only the jungle and the bond they shared, a bond that didn't need words. When Lila felt sad, Kumo would sit close to her, his large frame providing comfort. When she felt happy, she would hum in a joyful tune, and Kumo would dance around her, his movements graceful and fluid, almost as if he were celebrating with her. He didn't need to understand everything about her. He just needed to feel her. For Lila, it was a revelation. She had never felt more seen, more understood. With Kumo, there was no need to explain herself. She didn't need to say anything. She only needed to be. In the quiet of the jungle, Lila found a peace she had never known before. She had finally found someone who truly understood her, someone who didn't need to speak the same language to know her heart. And as they sat together, surrounded by the sounds of the forest, Lila realized that sometimes the most powerful form of communication isn't spoken at all. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the village, something unusual happened. Lila had ventured into the jungle, as she always did, to meet Kumo. But this time, something felt different. The air was heavy, charged with an unease she couldn't quite place. She reached the familiar clearing where Kumo usually waited, but he wasn't there. She waited for a moment, listening to the sounds of the jungle around her, but there was no sign of him. Lila's heart began to race. She knew something was wrong. Just as she turned to leave, she heard the sound. A deep, resonant growl. It echoed through the trees, sending a chill down her spine. She looked up, her eyes scanning the tree line, but she saw nothing. The growl came again, closer this time. Lila's heart skipped a beat as she turned around, eyes wide with fear. And there, emerging from the jungle, were the villagers. A small group of them, armed with makeshift weapons, their faces twisted with fear and anger. They had come to find her. "She's been out here too long," one of the men muttered, his eyes locked on her. "She's been with that beast." Lila didn't understand. She tried to speak, tried to explain that Kumo wasn't dangerous, that he was her friend. But no words came. Her throat tightened and panic surged inside her. She had no way of making them understand. The villagers weren't listening. They were afraid, and fear had clouded their judgment. They said the gorilla had cursed her, that he was a danger to the village, and they weren't going to wait any longer to do something about it. Lila stepped back, her eyes searching desperately for Kumo, hoping he would appear and stop them. She wanted to shout, to warn them, but her voice felt like a stranger in her throat. The villagers were already moving toward the jungle with torches in hand, determined to find Kumo and drive him away, or worse. She ran. She ran through the dense undergrowth, her feet barely touching the ground. She had to find him. She had to stop them. Her mind raced with thoughts of Kumo, of his gentle hums, his deep eyes, the way he had been the only one to ever understand her. The fear that gripped her heart was not for herself, but for him. But the villagers were closing in, and time was running out. She pushed forward, praying that somehow Kumo would hear her, that he would know she was coming. She didn't have to wait long. As if the jungle itself had answered her call, Kumo appeared from the shadows, his massive form stepping out into the clearing. He looked calm, his eyes scanning the scene with a quiet intelligence. But when he saw the villagers, his posture shifted. He understood the danger, and he was ready to protect her. Kumo took a slow, deliberate step forward, letting out a deep, guttural growl. The villagers froze, their eyes wide with fear. They had never seen Kumo this close, and they had never seen such power in an animal before. Lila's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, trying to reach Kumo, trying to make the villagers understand that he wasn't their enemy. But it was too late. The tension in the air was palpable, and the villagers weren't backing down. Desperation set in, and Lila knew what she had to do. She couldn't let them harm Kumo. She would do anything to keep him safe. But as the villagers raised their weapons, ready to strike, Lila stepped between them and Kumo, her eyes full of determination. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's not what you think. He's my friend." Her words were lost in the chaos. The villagers didn't understand, and in their fear, they were blind to the bond that Lila and Kumo shared. But Kumo didn't need words. He stood tall, his body a wall between Lila and the villagers, his deep growl a warning. And then, without another sound, Kumo turned and retreated into the jungle, vanishing like a shadow. The villagers stood there, still and silent. They had not expected this. They had not expected him to back down. But the fear that had once driven them to hunt him now held them in place, unsure of what to do next. Lila watched as Kumo disappeared into the trees, her heart heavy with the knowledge that they were both in danger. But she also knew one thing for certain: she would never let anyone separate them. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was a calm, pastel blue, and the next, dark clouds rolled in, covering the sun with an eerie swiftness. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the air turned thick with the promise of rain. Lila stood at the edge of the jungle, watching the sky, feeling the tension in the air. It was as if the world was holding its breath. The first raindrops fell, heavy and cold, splattering against the earth. Lila didn't move. She had learned long ago that the jungle had its own rhythm, its own heartbeat. And right now, it was restless. She turned to head back home, but before she could take a step, the wind howled louder, pushing her forward. She stumbled, her footing unsteady, and that's when she heard it. A cry, a desperate roar. Lila froze. It was Kumo. Without thinking, she dashed into the jungle, her feet slipping on the wet ground as she ran, her heart pounding in her chest. The rain was coming down in torrents now, the jungle around her becoming a blur of green and gray. But all that mattered was Kumo. She knew the roar wasn't a call of danger, not from him. It was a cry of distress, of fear. She had heard it before. The sound he made when something was wrong. As she pushed forward, the jungle seemed to grow darker, the trees bending under the fierce winds. She barely noticed the rain pouring down on her, or the mud that sucked at her boots. Her only thought was Kumo. She had to reach him. She had to make sure he was okay. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she found him. Kumo was standing in the middle of a clearing, his massive frame hunched against the wind, his eyes wide with panic. The river, which had always been a calm, steady force in the jungle, had swollen with the rain, and it was rushing faster and faster, rising to dangerous levels. The bridge that connected the jungle to the village had already been swept away. Kumo looked up when he saw Lila, his gaze locking with hers, a silent plea in his eyes. He needed help, and more than that, he was trying to protect her from what was coming. The floodwaters were rising rapidly, and there was no way to escape, not without crossing the river. Lila's mind raced. She couldn't think. She couldn't hear the warnings of her own fear, the panic in the storm, the rising waters. All she could think about was Kumo. Without another moment of hesitation, Lila ran towards him, the ground beneath her feet slippery and unstable. She knew the river was too strong to cross alone, but Kumo wasn't alone. She had to trust him. Kumo's gaze softened as she approached, and in that instant, he seemed to understand what she was planning. He lowered his body, his back facing the rising flood, and he made a sound, a low, rumbling hum, not of warning, but of comfort, as if telling her it would be okay. Lila climbed onto his back, her fingers gripping his fur as the rain continued to pour down around them. With a powerful movement, Kumo began to move, carefully navigating the rising water. The current was strong, but Kumo was stronger. Each step was a struggle, but he kept moving, his body steady and sure beneath her. Lila held on tight, her heart racing, not from fear, but from the overwhelming feeling of being safe. Despite the chaos, despite the storm and the flood, Kumo was there, and in his presence, there was peace. The water rose higher, and for a moment, it seemed as though they might be swept away. But Kumo pressed on, his muscles rippling with effort, his every movement filled with determination. He was not going to let the storm take them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the safety of the higher ground. The floodwaters began to recede, and the storm, as quickly as it had arrived, began to calm. The rain softened to a gentle drizzle, and the jungle slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. Lila slid off Kumo's back, her legs shaky, but her heart full of gratitude. She looked at him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't afraid. The storm had passed, and so had the danger. They had made it. Kumo looked back at her, his deep eyes filled with something like understanding. There were no words between them, but there didn't need to be. In that moment, they both knew something. They had saved each other. And in a world where no one else understood them, that was enough. The days after the storm were quiet, almost peaceful. The village had settled back into its routine, but Lila's world had changed. She had always known she didn't fit in with the villagers, but now it felt more obvious than ever. They didn't understand her bond with Kumo, and they never would. But the truth was, she didn't need their understanding anymore. She had Kumo. And that was all that mattered. Every day she would go into the jungle, her heart filled with anticipation, her steps light as she moved toward the clearing where Kumo waited for her. The two of them had grown closer, their connection stronger with each passing day. They had their own language now, not just the hums, the growls, and the sounds of the jungle, but something deeper, a silent understanding that only they shared. But the villagers weren't content to let things be. Their fear had not dissipated, and rumors continued to spread. They told stories of the wild gorilla, the beast that had taken Lila away. They spoke of curses, of danger, and of the need to protect the village from the creature that lived in the jungle. Lila heard the whispers, felt the eyes watching her every time she walked through the village. One day, as she approached the edge of the jungle, she saw a group of men gathering near the trees. They were armed with axes and torches, their faces hard with resolve. They had come to hunt Kumo. Lila's heart sank. She had known this day might come, but it didn't make it any easier. She couldn't let them harm him. She couldn't let them destroy the only true friend she had ever known. Her feet moved before she could think, rushing toward the group of men. She shouted, her voice trembling, but full of desperation. "Stop! He's not a threat! He's my friend!" The men turned to her, their eyes cold, their minds made up. "Lila, you don't understand," one of them said. "That creature is dangerous. We've seen what it can do. It's only a matter of time before it attacks. We have to protect the village." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. They thought they were protecting the village, but in truth, they were blind to the bond she shared with Kumo. They were blinded by fear, by superstition. "I won't let you hurt him," she said, her voice firm, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She stepped between them and the jungle, her eyes locked on theirs. "I won't let you take him from me." The men hesitated, looking at each other, uncertain. But their resolve was stronger than her pleas. They began to push past her, determined to carry out their plan. In that moment, a deep, rumbling growl filled the air. It was Kumo. He emerged from the shadows, his massive form stepping into the clearing, his eyes glowing with a quiet fury. His presence was enough to stop the men in their tracks. They had never seen him this close, never felt the power radiating off him like this. Lila stepped back, her heart racing. She wanted to say something, to tell the men that Kumo wasn't dangerous, that he would never hurt anyone. But the look in their eyes told her that words wouldn't change anything. Kumo let out another growl, this one louder, more threatening. His stance was protective, his eyes never leaving the men. It was clear he was ready to defend himself. And Lila. The men stood frozen, unsure of what to do. They had never seen Kumo act like this, but the fear in their eyes was undeniable. Slowly, they backed away, their weapons lowering, the tension still thick in the air. Without a word, they turned and left the jungle, retreating into the village. Lila stood there, her heart still pounding, as she watched them go. She didn't feel relief. She didn't feel victory. She only felt a deep, aching sadness. She knew this wasn't over. The village would never accept Kumo. They would never understand the bond they shared, but she couldn't change their minds. All she could do was protect him, just as he had protected her. Kumo stepped closer, his large hand resting gently on her shoulder, a silent gesture of reassurance. She turned to him, her eyes full of gratitude, and for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. She was no longer alone, and for her, that was enough. But deep in her heart, she knew that the storm wasn't over yet. The villagers would come again, and next time, she might not be able to protect Kumo, but she wasn't going to give up, not without a fight. The days grew heavier, the tension in the village like a storm on the horizon. Lila could feel it everywhere, in the way the villagers watched her with wary eyes, in the whispers that followed her through the streets, in the quiet murmurs at the marketplace. They feared Kumo, and they feared her. It was only a matter of time before they would act on that fear. But she wasn't ready to give up yet. She couldn't. Kumo had become her family, the one who understood her in ways no one else ever could. Every day she spent with him in the jungle only strengthened her belief that they had something that couldn't be broken. The villagers might never understand, but she knew the truth. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent into the horizon, Lila returned to the jungle. The air was thick with the scent of wet leaves and earth, the kind of evening where everything in the jungle seemed to hum with life. As she walked toward their meeting spot, she found herself deep in thought. What would happen if the villagers came for him again? What would she do? She reached the clearing, but this time, Kumo wasn't there waiting for her. The space felt empty, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. She called out softly for him, her voice echoing in the stillness. No response. Her heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. Lila's feet moved before she could stop herself, her instincts pulling her deeper into the jungle. She wasn't sure what she feared, whether it was the villagers or something else, but she had to find him. She couldn't lose him, not after everything they had shared. As she ventured further, the jungle grew darker, the trees seeming to close in around her. The storm clouds had gathered again, and a thick fog began to roll in. She could feel the weight of the air around her, heavy and suffocating. There was no sound, no animal calls or rustling of leaves, It was as if the jungle itself had gone silent. And then she heard it. A low, painful cry. A sound that was unmistakable. Kumo. Lila's heart raced as she followed the sound, her steps quickening, driven by fear and desperation. She pushed through the thick brush, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The cry came again, closer this time. She finally broke through the trees and into a small clearing where she saw Kumo. But what she saw nearly stopped her heart. Kumo was injured. His side was torn, blood staining his silver fur. His eyes were wide with pain and confusion as he struggled to stand. Lila's stomach twisted with dread. She rushed to him, kneeling beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his arm. "Kumo, no!" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "What happened?" Kumo let out another soft growl, not of aggression but of weakness. His eyes met hers, and in them, Lila saw the fear. The same fear she had felt when the villagers had come for him. He was trying to protect her, trying to fight back, but the villagers had overwhelmed him. They had attacked him. The anger inside Lila flared up, but she pushed it down. This wasn't the time. She needed to help him. "Don't worry," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady as she stroked his fur gently. "I'm here. I'm not going to let them hurt you. We'll get through this, okay?" Kumo let out a soft grunt, his body relaxing slightly at her touch. His trust in her was unspoken, but it was there in every movement he made. Lila's heart ached as she looked at the wounds on his side. The villagers had gone too far. This was no longer about fear. It was about something deeper, a hatred they couldn't see, an ignorance that ran so deep they couldn't understand the bond between her and Kumo. But she didn't care. Nothing else mattered. Lila stood up slowly, glancing around the jungle. She knew she had to act quickly. Kumo couldn't stay out here, not like this. She couldn't let him suffer, and she couldn't let the villagers think they had won. "Come on, Kumo," she said softly, her voice determined. "We're going to get you to safety." With great care, she helped him to his feet. His movements were slow and cautious, but he stood with her support, his large form leaning heavily on her. Together, they made their way back toward the deeper parts of the jungle, away from the village, away from the people who had tried to hurt him. They walked in silence, the weight of the world pressing down on them. But Lila knew one thing. She wasn't going to give up, not now, not ever. The journey was long, and the night grew darker, but Lila didn't stop. She wouldn't stop until Kumo was safe. They had been through too much together to let this be the end. And as they disappeared into the thick jungle, the storm behind them seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet promise. They would find a way to live in peace, no matter the cost.